something that they believe in. They have to reaffirm each time, in the way, I don't remember what the formula is, but each day you count the number of days since you had your last drink, and you realize that any slip backwards, and you can go back to where you were before you started your recovery. So they act as, in fact, as I understand it, alcoholics don't say, I'm a former alcoholic. They say, I'm a recovering alcoholic, but they realize that the personality aspects that caused them to turn to alcohol in the first place are probably still there. They just have to deal with it in another way. And so, okay, so that's background. And so Bush decides, well, okay, what can I do with my life? You know what? I've got a very famous name. I can go into politics. And so, sort of like Theodore Roosevelt, who deals with his own psychological issues by going into politics, so does George W. Bush. And it's relatively easy in Texas, because Texas, you can get into politics, a famous name in the state. It was a state that was turning Republican at the time he went into politics. And it's a state where the governor doesn't have to do a whole lot. It's a great state to run for president from, because you can have been governor, and you can just shift the blame for what you didn't get done on the lieutenant governor, who's actually more powerful in Texas than the governor is. But in addition, okay, so that's background. He goes into politics. He discovers that he can get the support of the Republicans in 98 and 99 when they're looking for somebody, anybody, who can defeat the Democrats. Because after 8 years of Bill Clinton, they're just desperate to get back in the White House. So the big names, the big money in the Republican Party, they're trying to figure out who can we run, who will win, who can win. And they realize, okay, George Bush, he's got a name. And George Bush, the present George Bush, is very canny, is very good at making people believe that he could win in 2000, making people believe that he's the kind of person that they want for president. And so the powers in the Republican Party put their money on George W. Bush. He gets elected in 2000, but under rather debatable circumstances. And under these circumstances, he is a minority president. He got fewer votes than Al Gore, fewer popular votes than Al Gore, and it's only by the mercy of the Supreme Court that he became president of the United States. Now, if you look at the first 8 months of Bush's presidency, compared with everything that came after, it's as though there's a different person there. And of course, the moment of change is 9/11. Okay, and here's my, again, this is my interpretation. This is what Brands will write in his biography of George W. Bush 25 years from now. I'm assuming they'll come up with a new interpretation between now and then. George Bush, as this recovering alcoholic, oh, and there's another aspect to this too. And one has to be careful about this because it gets on people's sensitivities. But George Bush is a born-again Christian and believes that God has a design for everybody's life. And an important aspect of your own salvation and your happiness on earth is figuring out what God has by way of design for your life. Why did God put me here? What does God want out of me? And it's not supposed to be that obvious. It's supposed to be something that you have to reflect on, you pray about, and you hope for some kind of enlightenment. Now, this is my interpretation, and I might be way off base, but between the sort of recovering alcoholic personality and this belief that God has a design for George W. Bush, and given the fact that he became president under these very contentious circumstances, I have to think that George Bush from January, well actually from, when is it, late November of 2000, when the Supreme Court says, you're the guy, until September 11th, 2001, George Bush is asking himself, what is the purpose of my presidency? Why did the stars align in such a way to make me president? Because there are all sorts of things that could have happened to make me not president. The vote could have gone the other way in Florida. It could have gone the other way in the Supreme Court. But God made me president for some reason. I just haven't figured out what that reason is yet. And then along comes 9/11. And George W. Bush has this epiphany. God made me president to deal with this threat to the United States. And the threat is from international terrorism. And how are we going to deal with it? Well, we could simply attack the al-Qaeda bases in Afghanistan, and of course the United States did, just a few months after 9/11. But that doesn't get at the heart of the problem. At that point, George W. Bush, who until then had a very modest agenda regarding foreign policy, in the campaign of 2000, he said, you know, we're not into nation building. We don't do this kind of stuff. We look after our own interests narrowly defined. But at that point, George W. Bush engaged on what is the most ambitious program of American foreign policy since, well, certainly since the early Cold War. Nothing less ambitious than remaking the Middle East. And the war in Iraq was all about changing circumstances in the Middle East. Now, the initial reason, rationale, excuse for going into Iraq was to seek out these weapons of mass destruction. But as members of the administration admitted, it became apparent after no weapons turned up, that was simply the most plausible excuse. That's what you could sell to Congress and the American people. Because even before Bush became president, there was a group within the conservative wing of the Republican Party, the neoconservatives, who've been talking about the need to overthrow Saddam Hussein and to try to democratize the Middle East. And George Bush bought into this. This was why he became president. This was what his purpose was. And like that recovering alcoholic, who recognizes that every day is a challenge. And the more adversity you face, the more your faith is being tested. And just because what you're doing becomes difficult, just because it becomes unpopular, is no reason to give it up. No. In fact, all the more reason to cling to it. And this is why I'm convinced that Bush will stick by the policy in Iraq, regardless of how unpopular it might become. And he'll go out, he's going to leave office, and in a certain respect, he's going to leave office unpopular. And in a certain respect, his very unpopularity convinces him that he's right. Because if he changed his policy on account of its unpopularity, well, then he would be failing the test. The test of faith is your ability to sustain the faith during difficult times. The test of the recovering alcoholic is, can you be in a room where other people are drinking and you not succumb to that temptation? So in this case, the worse things get in Iraq, the more convinced he is that he's right. Now, does he think about how historians like me are going to view him? I don't know. I think that's the least of his concerns. He's really concerned is this the right thing to do? And there is a certain part of every American voter who admires that kind of thing. We like the president who stands up for what he believes, even if it's unpopular. Of course, here's where the rub comes in. It might be unpopular. The question is it right? Is there any hope of democratizing the Middle East? If there is, and if the experiment in democracy in Iraq succeeds, and if it spreads throughout the Middle East, so that 50 years from now, the Middle East is filled with democratic countries, and the Middle East, the Muslim Middle East, begins to look like Western Europe. Western Europe was the most warlike place on earth for the first half of the 20th century. And then everybody bought into democracy and free market economies, and it's been peaceful and prosperous. There is a success story. And if the same thing happens in the Middle East, then historians like me and my successors, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, will look on George Bush as the great visionary of American foreign policy, the great visionary of world statesmen, because he saw the possibility in the Middle East that nobody else saw. He took a gamble. He sent American troops, expended American treasure, but the result was this brilliant success, and he will be hailed as one of the great American presidents, if he's right. If he's wrong, then Iraq will become another Vietnam. It will become worse than Vietnam because we'll probably be stuck there forever. And although the United States lost in Vietnam, it didn't drive the price of oil up to $109 a barrel, which is what oil was at this morning. Okay? So if he's wrong, then it's a disaster. And he will be seen as arrogant, foolish, somebody who's playing out his own psychological problems on the world stage, who sacrificed, who knows, by that time, tens of thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives, to this sort of private psychological problem he's trying to work out. So the thing is, we don't know which scenario is going to unfold. Check back with me 50 years from now and I'll let you know.